Welcome back. I'm Gopar. This is the second episode or video, I should say, on this series on creating your own WSGI web framework. All right, so let's get right to it. Yeah. So first thing is first. I'm going to I'm going to start off with the code from the last video, which is just a sample on a very bare minimal web framework on how to do this. So we're gonna build on top of what we have here, and we can go two routes. We can either build it via function based or as a class based, like it's here. For this series, we're gonna do it as a class based. You feel free to do it as a function based and make it a little bit more challenging or funner for you, whatever you want to do. But we're gonna go on the class from this point on. On the last video, I was able to showcase the very simple web framework, but for this video, we're gonna build the skeleton or the life cycle of the web framework when a request comes all the way to when it's returned. So we will not be, at the end of this video, there will not be something that you can run via a web server. It will just be the templating. But on the next video, we should be able to have something that is able to have up and running. But for this video, you'll mainly be coding up the life cycle, and that way you get an idea on how it goes through a typical web framework. Of course, web frameworks like Django or Flask might have some more details along the way, but this is generally how most frameworks work, regardless of what language or what framework it is. They typically follow these life cycles. Okay. So what are we gonna do? We are gonna get rid of these two strings. We're gonna actually use some types, so because I like types, annotations. I like them. I think they're useful. So we'll use some stuff, and then we are of course gonna set some default content types of what our web framework accepts. So when you make a request in the headers, you can say, hey, this is going to be a text request, HTML, text HTML request, a JSON request, XML request, that type of deal. You can even make it a pizza request. As long as your web framework knows how to interpret that type of request, it can handle it. But of course, we have standards like in everything else. So those standard ones are application JSONs and text HTML and things like that. So we'll just use those two basic ones for now. So our web framework for now will accept HTML and JSON, which is pretty cool and standard. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and start, shall we? Let's create the constructor. It's going to take in a routes. So this is where the routes object was going to be a dictionary, which defines when someone wants to go to like /pizza, we'll take them to the pizza endpoint and things like that. As you guys can tell, I like pizza. Middleware list. It's going to be a list of middlewares, and it's going to be set for none right now, and allowed content types. It's going to equal a list of strings, and like as you see here, it's going to say what content types is allowed, list string, and then it's going to equal to none. Now, the reason why it's none, it's because we can't leave it as an empty list because of how Python works. I'm not going to go into detail. If you leave it as an empty list, you're going to be in for some nasty bug surprises. But for now, we won't worry about that. So we're just going to do a routes route, middleware equals middleware, very standard boilerplate, and allowed content types equals allowed, allowed content types. Beautiful, things like that. But if we don't pass anything, we are gonna we're gonna default to an empty list, or we're gonna pass default into default content types. All right, cool. So now we have constructor. So in here we can actually pass things what we want, and as you can see, routes is actually mandatory. It's not optional. So we can just do we can pass in an empty dictionary, and it should work automatically. But we're still in the work in progress, so let's not worry about that now. Let's jump into the call. So just a quick one-on-one on the call. So when you do this, when you initialize the object, it's going to call the init function, right? But if you call app like this, now that it's been instantiated, it will always call the call method. Ta-da, very magical, right? Makes sense. This dunder method will be called whenever you call this. So if you call it again, this will call the method twice. You cannot do this because that is calling this method and then doing that call right here. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. That way a quick one-on-one on how that works. Like I said, I won't do any deep dives. If people are interested in me explaining these concepts, more advanced concepts in Python, then I will gladly make some videos. But other than that, let's continue to not stall. Okay, so what are we going to do here? Well, I'm going to erase all of this because this is now the life cycle. Whenever we go into this method, it's going to be the life cycle on how web frameworks work. So a request is going to come in via the environment. So this environment is actually a dictionary, and this response is actually a callable. I believe that's what it is. So it's going to be a callable. Callable is inside. Yeah, okay. It exists. I just checked the documentation. It popped up. All right, cool. So callable is a thing. I was just making sure. Okay, request equals request environment variable. So this class does not exist. We're going to implement it in the next video. This is just going to be a stub. So like I said, skeleton of how the web framework works. So we get a request. So we get a request out of the environment. This environment dictionary will hold everything that you need to have to create a request object, like those that you see in Flask or in Django. So we're going to create it out of the environment dictionary that is passed in, and then we're going to say, hey, if the request content type is not in the self.allow types, so in other words, they're requesting some type of content that we're not sure, like they're requesting XML on a JSON endpoint. We're like, what? What's going on? We're going to say error. Actually, let me just copy this. That way, request.content type not allowed. There we go. So of course, this can vary. You can make it into that this XML, that this content type checks on a per endpoint basis and not just the entire web framework like we're doing here, of course. So this is very bare bones, however much control you want. But for now, we're going to keep it simple and go on with our lives. Now, for each middleware in self.middleware, in the middle that we created, we are going to pass in the request, but we're going to update the request of whatever middleware we are using. So each middleware, it's going to have two methods, a pre-processed request and a post-process request. And I'm going to create that in a second, but for now, I'm just stubbing it out. So at the end, we can see how it all looks. And I'll probably stop saying that because it might start annoying you guys. I'm assuming you guys get the point by now, that it is just stubbing out. So we pass in the request, it's going to do some magic to it, and then it's going to pass in that newly updated request. Cool. Now, what happens after that? Well, we're going to try and route the request. So we're going to do routes.get request.path.info. And it's all going to be uppercase. So self.routes.get, if route is none, so if we don't find any route that matches whatever the user wants, we're just going to return a 404. So we'll actually need to replace this with something that says a 404, not just a number, but we'll get to it. Route method equals get attribute. Yes, so route, and you'll see what I'm doing right now in a second once I explain it. Request method dot lower none. If route method is none, return a 405. So okay, so this says, hey, does slash pizza exist? If it does, then route is not going to be none, and we're not going to return a 404. But if slash pizza is not an actual valid route, let's return 405. Let's say it is. So it's like, oh, slash pizza, it's a valid route. Well, did the user request a get method, a post method, delete, patch? Well, if they requested a delete method and we don't accept that type of HTTP verb, well, then we're just going to say 405, method not allowed, because 405 is method not allowed in HTTP language. So that's what we return, because we want to be correct in what we do. Because one thing I strongly dislike is when a web server does not respond correctly. Like it just responds with like a 500 or something, and it's not supposed to do that. I strongly dislike that. So I want you guys to learn properly. And if I say something wrong in this video, then call me out. That way, not only do I learn, but everybody else learns that is watching and following along. All right, on to the next song. So let's assuming everything is right, we're going to get a response from route method if we call it right. So we should get something, and we should also get some status status headers body from let's see, response.whiskey response. So this is going to return some type of object, and then this object will have a method called whiskey response that should return the status, headers, and response. So all these three objects are needed for whiskey to work appropriately. So I'm just creating a little helper function that does that automatically. It'll all make sense once we create it more in the following videos. So for middleware, again, in self.middleware, status, headers, body. So this is the post process, like I was saying, post process request, status, headers, and body. Now, the reason why I'm passing the status, headers, and body is because when in middleware, there might be times where we want to manipulate the status, we might want to manipulate the header, or we might want to manipulate the body. We have no desire to manipulate the request because the request has already been handled. We want to manipulate what's being outputted now because this is at the end. There's no benefit of manipulating the request now because it's done. But anyways, let's go continue, start response. So the standard thing that we saw in the last video, and response headers. Actually, response headers. Actually, that's wrong. It should just be headers. Is there response headers? Nope. Okay, cool. Yeah, it should just be headers. And then we are going to return the body, just like that. So this is your typical web framework lifecycle, greatly simplified, but it gets straight to the point. So I'm going to go over it once again. So what do we have? We have a class called pit. Oh, I created it, but I don't even know how to pronounce it. So we're just going to call it pit. And then we have the constructor. We're saying, hey, when I create this, I'm going to give you a couple of routes that will match the web framework. So if someone says /cars or /pizza or /dominoes, it'll try to look that up, and so we pass it and save it to the routes. We give it some middleware to manipulate the request and the response output, and then we say, hey, what type of content types do we allow? And we created down here. Now, in the call function, when the web server is going to call the web framework, it's going to pass in the environment, which it gets from the user's request and everything. We don't have to worry about that. It's given automatically. And the start response, which is also something that the web server takes care of, giving the web framework. So the only thing that we need to know is just call the start response with the status and the headers, and everything will be all right. So we say, all right, let's create a request out of the environment dictionary that the web server was able to get out of the user's request. And then we say, hey, did the request have some type of content type? And is that content type even an allowed type? And if it's not, we just say, hey, we don't accept this content type. Then we say, all right, middleware, do your thing. If the middleware needs to change anything, it will go ahead and do here whatever it needs to do. Example of this is, for example, creating a very unique ID per request. If you've ever been on a website and then it says, oh, some type of error 405 or server 500, and it gives you like some ticket number or anything, it's done via middleware. So whenever a request comes in, well, it's one way of doing it. But one way of doing it, and it's a very obvious example that I can think of on how to do it. So the user doesn't set the request, the middleware sets it. The web framework shouldn't have to worry about that. So it just says, all right, I'm going to inject the request right here, and then at the end, it'll say, oh, hey, this request finished successfully or whatnot. But yeah, let's go ahead and do this. Actually, we might need to pass in the request because the request has a thing. Well, we'll update as we go. Let's see, for middleware, yes, I just explained that. Then I say, hey, does the route exist? If it doesn't, return a 404. And if the route exists, saying, hey, does it accept a get or post or whatever the user wanted? If it doesn't accept, we'll return a 405. Let them know that that method is not allowed. And then we run that method, that route, and get whatever response it returns. And then we run this whiskey, the response function helper that will return the status, headers, and body. So we'll just format it so that we can pass it on to the web server. But before we do that, we're going to run the middleware and run some post-processing on it. And then after that, we will finally call the start response and tell the server, hey, we're ready. The status is going to be this, the headers is going to be this, and here is the body to return to the user. But that is pretty much the life cycle, pretty quick and easy. But yeah, I hope this was informative, and on the next video we should have something that you are able to run locally and get something up and running. Yeah, it'll be very bare bones, but it will get you somewhere. All right, sweet. Thank you.